Okay, well, there's a number of us here. I think we can sort of kick off. I can do some housekeeping anyway. My name is Kat Hughes. I'm Research Communications Manager with Autistica. I'm also autistic, and my background was my PhD is in communication and language and infant language development for autistic infants. And then I also worked in university supporting autistic students. So between the two, I'm incredibly interested in all of the talks that are happening today. So I feel very lucky to be able to share. You can ask questions. So if you look at the Q&A button right down the bottom in the middle, you can ask our panelists any questions there, and they might be able to type up some of their responses, but I'll also ask the questions, that are as many as I can anyway. If you're following along on Twitter, you can use the hashtag Autistica Festival, and our handle is @Autistica. If you want to talk to us as well. I've asked all of the speakers to let us know if there's anything in their session that might be a little bit upsetting or challenging. So they're going to say if there's any sort of trigger warnings ahead of time. So if you want to take a break for that particular talk, that's absolutely fine if you feel like it might be just a little bit more than you need this morning. There'll be lots of different opinions discussed, and that's part of what we're encouraging at the festival. So there might be some things that you don't necessarily agree with, and that's absolutely fine. But I suppose the main thing is to try and be respectful in how you disagree or how you want to have that conversation. And then also it's a relaxed festival. So we're all in our homes. I'm in my bedroom. My dog is behind me. There will be spouses and children and cats passing by potentially, so that's absolutely fine. We may have some technical difficulties. We're all figuring out Zoom still, so that's fine as well. So yeah, just bear with us and relax yourselves and have a cup of tea and enjoy the conversation and the presentations today. So I will kick off by introducing my fabulous co-chair, Lene Buckle, who's going to talk a bit about her experience around communication and language. Thanks, Lene.
Hi, thanks, Kat. So I'm Lene, and as Kat said, I'm the community co-chair, which I think means I'm your token autistic. But I like to make a bit more of these talks when I can. Or you could say this is my way of sneaking in when they didn't accept my proposal for my abstract for the conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself rather than my research. So in my family of 7, my eldest daughter serves as our token NT. I work with autism in various paid and voluntary roles, and I'm a PhD student studying autism. My research is about inertia, which has almost nothing to do with language, communication, and relationships. So at first I questioned why I would be wanted for the topics in this particular session. But looking at the abstracts, I can safely say that all of the topics relate at least to some aspect of my life, from my multilingual family to my work for the National Autistic Task Force, which I'll talk about in a bit. So unlike most so-called high-functioning autistic people my age, I wasn't a late diagnosed autistic who flew under the radar for decades. I was actually spotted in early childhood in the 1970s, when I was not speaking and very unsubtly autistic. I only vaguely remember it myself, and I know it's unusual, but I've also been told that I was remarkably tantrum-free. I think that's because distress happens when there's a difference between what we want and what we can do, or at least strive for. And I didn't especially want anything. Back then, they thought I was learning disabled, but when I was about 6, I figured out how language worked, and by the time I was 8, I was considered gifted. So in my wanderings through university education in my 30s, I did a master's in bioethics. That was the wrong path. I thought it would be fun. But through that, I developed a very clear stance that any intervention that supports autonomy is almost always good, and that in order to be autonomous, one has to communicate. So regardless of whether the person has a drive to communicate, anything that improves communication is almost always good. So now I apply this principle in my work for the National Autistic Task Force. NAT are a very small group of autistic people working to improve the quality of life of those who often get forgotten by the autistic community. Those who have their freedom, autonomy, and basic rights thwarted. And a big part of the underlying issues that lead to these unacceptable living conditions are that they have limited effective communication. So through my involvement with NAT and in my work as a trainer for frontline care staff, I emphasize the need to consider all types of communication and not focus exclusively on speech. While my son's speech stalled at around 5 words for well over a year, because we used Makaton, which we'd used following on from using baby sign, we could literally watch his underlying language develop from single words through multi-word phrases while he still wasn't speaking. Shortly, we'll hear about an app used as an alternative communication for non-speaking children. So communication is essential for the expression of autonomy, and having choice and control over our lives is the most important aspect of being an adult. And a bit later, we'll hear about camouflaging autistic traits. So I have 3 autistic children out of my five kids. And while I have one child who does not camouflage and has suffered severe bullying as a result, I have another who has quietly ruined her mental health trying to be something she isn't. It seems as if in the NT world, we can't win. And this is what underlies my other main occupation, Autscape. Autscape is a 3-day residential event run annually for the last 15 years that creates autistic space where it's okay to take off the mask and relax for a bit. This year we've had to move online, but we're going ahead with the event in 2.5 weeks. So I get to learn a little bit about how to do webinars by doing this this morning. And it's through communication that we can build relationships, and being able to relate genuinely without masking is necessary for a full life. As my son says, it's easier to make friends with autistic people, and we owe it to all autistic people to have such opportunities to be the normal ones and not be expected to adapt. So again, on a personal level, if I'm asked which has been the most helpful professional to do with my family's autism, I invariably say it was my son's speech therapist. She wasn't afraid to tell me when his atypical speech patterns were typical of autistic children. She kept him on her books after his speech came on with typical autistic suddenness at the age of 2.5, specifically so she could write a report for the pediatrician in support of his diagnosis. And so I particularly appreciate the work, like the report we're about to hear from Jennifer Warwick on early identification of social communication needs. And that's my bit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lene. And I think it's very apparent why you were asked to be part of this panel, because that was really relevant to all of the topics that we're going to be speaking on today. So yeah, next up, as Lene said, we have Jennifer Warwick, whose presentation is Early Identification of Social Communication Needs, Evidence on a New Cross-Cultural Preschool Assessment. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
Hi there, and thank you so much. Actually, I was just about to write in the chat, I'd love to hear more about that, the space that you mentioned. I think I'm lucky to work with quite a lot of older teenage girls, and I think something like that, it sounds fantastic just when you were touching on the masking. But I'll turn now to what I'm meant to be talking about. Hang on, I just need to share my screen, make sure it's the right size, and then we will be ready. Sorry, it's not at the, hang on 2 seconds, sorry. Going back to the beginning, let's make sure that we're doing, oh, sorry, hang on. I had it right there, and now I've managed to lose what we're doing. Okay, right, we should be ready to go. Okay, for some reason, I'm really sorry, it's not, I'm struggling with my IT this morning. I don't know. Okay.
It's been a feature across the
I'm not sure why it's not coming up, but it should do. Here it is. Right. I'm so sorry about that. It always throws me a little bit when it's not working. I hope everybody can see this now. I'll start from the beginning. Okay. So I'm talking about a new assessment that's called the Early Sociocognitive Battery. Now, my background, I'm a speech and language therapist. My background, I've worked with autistic children pretty much since I graduated in 2006 when I trained to be a speech and language therapist. I came to speech therapy slightly later as a career choice. I think I'd always done a lot of voluntary work with children with communication needs, and it just struck me as something that I wanted to do. I've been really lucky to be involved in this project, which has been from City University, and involved in kind of the development of a clinical tool. And what we're going to talk about today is just really what it is, how it's been developed, and what the implications are for practice and for children as well and their families. I think there's a lot about early intervention, and I think as practitioners it's something that we talk about all the time, but how do we signpost children to that early identification, early intervention? How do we make sure that they're getting what they need to? Okay, so what is the ESB? It's an assessment that is, I've got some references at the end, it's theoretically driven, it's evidence-based. It came out of some research by Professor Penny Roy and Professor Shula Chiat, and as I said, it was very much a collaborative project. So my background, I'm not a researcher in any way. I kind of consider myself a clinician, and to me research seems something that's quite far away in terms of being involved in universities and all of those things. I did do an MSc, and I'm now actually doing a part-time PhD, partly because of the interest in what I've got out of being involved in this project. But actually what's great is seeing something that's developed in the academic field really translating to be something that's in use with everyday, well, being used every day, and it's something that's useful for parents and for children as well. So the research originally started in 2003 in terms of some longitudinal studies that were done by Professor Penny Roy and Shula Chiat, which are worth looking at if you're interested. And I think what we know is that there is that very well documented link between language development in all children and interpersonal engagement. We know that skills like joint attention are so important for language. We know that if you're in the park and a child has the opportunity to point to something and say, ah, and they're looking to you to label bus, and they get that opportunity to see the bus, you know, match what they're pointing to and learn the word. And I think we know those skills are really important for language. We know that they're often something that are tricky for children, for autistic children and children with social communication needs. I think there's a real key point in terms of considering these skills objectively. So you mentioned speech and language therapists, and I think very often speech therapists are the first professionals that might see children who present with a communication delay. Now, often I think what we're doing as a speech and language therapist is making judgments about what a child's performance is on certain sort of informal tasks. But actually, if we can use something that's a little bit more standardized, a bit more systematic, the information that we're getting is much more robust in terms of having evidence to say, actually, this is what a child is going to need. So even way before they've got a diagnosis. So this is something that we'd use for children with language and social communication needs, so children with quite a wide range of needs initially. So the assessment takes about 15 minutes to carry out, and there's 3 key tasks. So we're looking at social responsiveness, joint attention, and symbolic comprehension. All very early skills. This is a video that will hopefully play. I'm not sure the sound will work, but it's still useful to look at. So in this video, the therapist is taking a strange object out of a bag and looking. All the child needs to do is we're looking to see, does the child look at her? So she's saying, my brother bought me some toys. And then she takes out a nappy and says, that's not a toy. We're just looking to see how the child responds. So there's nothing they need to do verbally. So the child is given 6 opportunities to respond to an adult's facial expression. We then move on to the next test, which is looking at joint attention, which I think, again, I think there's so much research about joint attention. It's such a key skill in developing communication and interaction. And I know it's something that there's a lot about in terms of how we assess it in the ADOS, but actually how can we look at these skills in a way that makes sense to parents? Because I think I'm always trying to explain things to parents in a way that is going to be meaningful. And I think to most people, if you talked about joint attention, they probably wouldn't know what you're talking about. So giving parents a really clear way to observe what their child's doing is sometimes a really good starting point to kind of think jointly then about what might be useful to work on in terms of therapy to support their skills and to support things at home. So this is the, sorry, so the child is actually not required to say anything at all, and it's a slightly strange scenario. All the tasks are meant to be quite fun and inviting. You get out a box of eggs, you take one egg which each has something inside it, you shake your egg out, you're waiting to see, does the child perhaps look from the egg to you? You then open the egg, do they have the opportunity to look from the contents of the egg back up to your face? And then you take something out from inside the egg. For example, it might be a tiny person or it might be a tiny candle, and then you're directing their attention to something else in the room. I bought my candle, or pointing at it as well to see how they respond. So you're looking at gaze alternation, following gaze, and following a point as well. And then we move on to the third subscale, which is looking at gesture. So how do children understand gestures? Can they understand that this means scissors? So they are presented with a choice of 6 objects, and they get to throw it down a chute, something that's quite motivating for them. So they have to choose the corresponding object. That might be scissors, a bottle, putting on a sock. Then the next part of that is identifying a miniature using in the same way, and then actually looking at substitute objects, because I think this is something that speech therapists are really guilty at. We talk a lot about pretend play, but actually a lot of those play routines are things that are very learned. So, oh, let's make a cup of tea, let's pretend it's hot. I think those are things that a lot of adults do with children all the time, and we're not truly looking at the ability to symbolize. So in this test, we're looking very specifically at, if you're pretending to eat from a shell, can a child then match that that's the symbolic, that the substitute object is a plate? Moving on, so the assessment is scored, and it provides a very structured and systematic tool to record these observations. And I think because the tasks are elicitation based, so we're putting the children in a situation where we're looking to how they respond. So that makes it something that's a little bit different from some other assessments, which are more based on parental rating or checklist kind of way of getting that information. The ESB, the assessment was standardised on 400 children across the UK. So we assessed children in Scotland and Wales. And actually, for me, on a sort of personal and professional level, it was really interesting and amazing to kind of be involved in that project. But it also just helped that driving through of something that I think we all felt was extremely clinically useful and very useful for parents and for children themselves, and allowing it to be something that will hopefully be more widely used. So what we do know about the ESB is that the long-term research done by Professor Chia and Professor Roy, we know that it is predictive of social communication difficulties and a late diagnosis of ASD. So if a preschool child scores in that lower range on the ESB, they are at risk of having a later diagnosis of ASD. And I think that's a key point, I think, in terms of thinking about how we access services. I mean, I'm constantly, as a speech therapist, trying to argue the case for children who have quite good language skills getting access to speech therapy to work on those much wider social communication skills. I think also it's predictive of ongoing contact with speech therapy. So children who had lower scores were the children who still received speech and language therapy intervention in their last year of primary school, which again I think is really key in terms of, if we're thinking about financial resource in terms of support for young people who needs to access what support, it can be helpful to think, okay, this child is going to need more support, so it's helpful to put that in place early on. Another key thing that's really important, part of the standardization data comes from a PhD project that was carried out in Saudi Arabia, and what it shows, and also we gathered a lot of data in London, and had very diverse kind of cohort, and we know that performance on the assessment is not affected at all by bilingualism, ethnicity, and that I think is a really key thing if you're a speech therapist or an early years professional working with children in a sort of diverse area, because it just helps to understand more about that picture. We also know that its socioeconomic status was much less of an impact than than it had on the language measures. So as part of the standardization, they used a vocabulary measure as well, which is all detailed in the references. So I think what we know about it is that it's psychometrically robust and it's reliable and valid, which I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think if you're interested, you can read further about it. And I think there's a really interesting, so the assessment is standardized for children up to 5, so it's a preschool measure, but you might be familiar with the PACT-G project, which was carried out sort of last year, and they used sorry, I can see this flashing. They used the ESB as an outcome measure as part of their project, and actually they found that the ESB was really helpful because it required the children to have sort of minimal understanding, or children who might be not communicating using words. They felt that it was something that could potentially be used as an outcome measure to measure how children were making progress in terms of interventions, especially for those children who were pre-verbal. So as a way of looking at how children are making progress with those sociocognitive skills that are key to communication. I think what's important, like I touched on, is just thinking about the relevance for children from diverse language and cultural backgrounds. And I think a key thing is, I think so often, I was speaking yesterday at another event, and there was a really interesting piece of research about how healthcare workers communicate with parents of autistic children. And I think just that bombarding of information and trying, I think, as much as possible to provide a clear framework for parents so that we're discussing things in a meaningful way and we can actually communicate our observations in an evidenced way as well, rather than just saying, okay, this is my clinical observation. If you have something that's standardized in terms of being able to say, well, this is what the assessment shows, and it being a useful tool for parents to be able to kind of watch that and do this jointly together, and that potential use as an outcome measure as well. Let's see, moving on. Sorry, it seems to have frozen. So really, to find out more, so we have just really recently set up a ESB website, which it's not perfect, but I think I'm definitely not a website designer, but part of the project was wanting to get, I mean, obviously now the kit's been sold by Hographer, so there is a charge for it. We used to just sort of make the kits at City University and sell them to cover the costs, but because it's published now, there is a charge for the assessment, obviously because they want to make a profit. But I think we have, as authors, we set up a website because we're really keen to hear from professionals and clinicians and even from parents as well about their experience of it, because we kind of truly believe that it's something that's really helpful in informing practice and supporting children and accessing interventions that they need. So have a look at the website. We will be uploading to kind of the case study section. So at the moment we've got a team in Manchester who are using the ESB as part of their sort of diagnostic pathway, and some other teams as well that are using it as part of projects or research projects and part of their routine kind of screening as well. So yes, and also sort of get in touch with me if you've got any questions. I can see something flashing, but I'm really sorry, I can't seem to access it, so I'm not sure if those are the questions. I would say as well, I did say at the beginning that I have a vomiting toddler downstairs, so if I'm not here for the next part of the questions, if I'm not able to join, I should be able to, but please do email me. I'm very happy to get in touch with people if they need to ask anything specific. So yes, and there's references, and just sort of coming to the end for that. I'll stop. Right, okay, I can see the questions now. Yes, I think I'm really sorry about the videos. videos didn't seem to have any audio, but I think that must just be about, I wouldn't worry about it not having audio because it's a non-verbal task. So it's just really looking at how the children respond, and I'll make sure that we have a Twitter account. I can share all the videos that we have on that as well, so you can have an opportunity to look at them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I will introduce to our next speaker. Thank you. You've gone above and beyond for being here with us this morning, Jennifer. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you later. But yeah, it's completely understandable if you can't make it back. So next up we have Jenny Gibson, who's speaking on play-based interventions to support social and communication development in autistic children aged 2 to 8 years. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm just working out how to share my screen again. Is that okay? Can you see the slides?
That's perfect.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about a systematic review that we've, the systematic scoping review that we've been carrying out in my research group, the Play and Communication Lab. So the Play and Communication Lab is based in the Peddle Centre at the University of Cambridge, and we work on topics relating to play and different aspects of communication development. In terms of content notices for the talk, there'll be a brief mention of applied behaviour analysis therapies later on. And I also just wanted to mention a potential conflict of interest. This work's been funded by Lego Foundation, and part of the therapies that come up in the review relate to Lego-based therapy. So I thought it was important just to mention that at the beginning. So I also wanted to introduce you to Carmen and Emma. They've been research assistants on my team for almost the past year, and they were very involved in this research, and they're listening here now, and they might be able to chip in if there are questions and answers in relation to some of the nitty-gritty of actually searching for the literature in this review. Okay. So to start off with, I want to introduce the idea of play and why I was particularly interested in it. So play is quite a broad construct, and it's very difficult to define when you start thinking about it. So for some people it means structured games, for others it means fantasy and pretending. Some people might want to engage in play in a very solitary way, and for other people it has quite social dimension. Some people like a lot of flexibility around rules in play, and other people are much more rigid. So we all have different ideas around play. But it is something that is kind of ubiquitous, particularly in childhood. People play all the time, children play. And it's thought to be quite important for the development of particularly social skills. So things like language development, social relating, conversation, have been strongly linked to play in the early years and beyond. And not only that, play is thought to be a kind of developmental mechanism for coping with new situations, for managing uncertainty and dealing with the unexpected, as well as something that's fun and relaxing and allows you to explore your environment. Now, humans are not the only animals that play, and I thought I'd just show you a quick video of some other animals playing, just to illustrate the social aspect. This works. Okay, so there's no real sound on this. It's just a video about a minute long of a very young puppy and a dog engaged in social play. So nobody teaches dogs how to do this. They have kind of set, almost ritualized behaviors around play. And in this instance, the older animal is kind of interacting and teaching the younger animal basic doggy social skills. So you can see the sort of facilitation element there. The older dog is waiting, holding back, and then lying down in that position that indicates that play is invited and encouraged. Okay, so I just wanted to show that to illustrate that play is something to take seriously, something that we see as potentially deeply rooted in our evolutionary past and in many different animals as a way of learning about the social world. I'm also quite inspired by the Playwork definition of play, and this talks about the importance of play as being freely chosen and something that children determine and control for themselves, and they do in their own way and for their own reasons. And I think that really relates to Lene's earlier point around having autonomy being very linked to this social communication dimension as well. I was also quite inspired by the work of Julie Godin and Anita Bundy in their concepts of playful engagement and intrinsic motivation. So for this study, I was quite interested in the ways in which play is often used to support social and communication skills in autistic children. And this sort of array of approaches that are out there. And I wanted to really think about how we can help practitioners and families navigate this very wide evidence space and make some choices about the kinds of play-based interventions that might be helpful for them. So our method was in these sort of three parts. We started with a stakeholder consultation about the issues. We then carried out a search of the literature, and then we tried to synthesize or summarize that literature in a way that would be helpful. Have I been muted?
No, we can hear you. Oh, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I got a notification that I was on mute.
Oh.
Can you still see my screen?
Yes,
Okay, good.
I think.
Oh.
Is it a painting? There we go. Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Perfect. There you go.
So the stakeholder consultation, we talked and we used the Autistic Discover network and some sort of informal connections that we had in our research group. Both autistic people, parents of autistic children, and practitioners working in relevant fields like speech and language therapy and education. And we were quite pleased that people agreed with us that the topic was one of importance and one of interest, and that almost everybody, although it wasn't 100%, felt that play-based interventions were acceptable and needed to be researched. But there were some differences of opinion. Some concerns were raised about potential behaviourist approaches to play, and people had different ideas of what might be appropriate at different age groups, and how play-based interventions might look in different settings. So, for example, early years compared to mainstream. So some people felt that play-based approaches became less appropriate as children got older. And a strong theme that came through was the importance of understanding an autistic view of play and how that might be different to neurotypical views of play or non-autistic views of play. And that's actually turned into a spin-off study, a qualitative study looking at those experiences. For the present study, we really wanted to provide a comprehensive map of the research that's out there that really drew on dimensions of interest to both practitioners, autistic people and their families, and to provide some way of accessing that, so some tools for thinking about the evidence base. We did a literature review to try and address these issues. So we looked for studies that had participants of autistic children up to the age of 8. Any kind of play-based intervention could be included. We specified that the intervention should target social and communication skills specifically. They were published in the last 10 years and they had to be in English or German because those are the languages that we could speak in the team. And we identified at the first pass of this search an incredible number of studies. So it's over 18,000 studies, but the important number that you need to look at in this chart is at the bottom. So we had 388 studies included in our final review after a kind of systematic and rigorous sifting process. In terms of the evidence synthesis, in order to kind of make sense of these almost sort of 400 studies, we categorized and coded them according to different features of interest. And I've just put on the slide there some of those. We don't have enough time to talk through them all, so I'm going to be picking out some highlights. But for example, we looked at the characteristics of who's been studied, what the role of play was within the intervention, how it had been studied, and whether they'd used robust study designs or not. So this is a slide showing you the different study designs. So of all the different types of play-based intervention, we saw that around about 20% of them were randomized controlled trials, and around about 15% were quasi-experimental. So that means they've used some aspects of experimental design, but they didn't have, I don't know, random allocations of control groups, for example. Now, those two categories at the beginning are the ones that we would consider most robust. The remaining studies, indeed the majority of the studies, didn't employ robust intervention designs. And indeed, over 50% of the studies had fewer than 10 participants. So this is a picture of a very much emerging evidence base where the quality of studies, or the stage at which they're at, is not quite as robust as we might like to inform intervention planning. We also found that there were lots of different outcomes measured, that there were lots of different categories of intervention type, and then we suggested some dimensions for practitioner appraisal. So in terms of outcome domains, social play skills in their own right were quite often targeted by play-based interventions. So this is quite interesting. So quite a lot of the interventions were actually targeted at teaching constructs like pretense or joining in collaborative play. We also saw interventions targeting language skills specifically, communication skills more broadly, and so on. The outcomes from this study will be posted in a preprint when we submit it for peer review. So if you want more detail, please do contact me and I'll send you a copy. In terms of the characteristics of the participants by IQ, not all studies reported an IQ measure or a kind of functioning measure, for example, the Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Scales. I'm just showing an example of IQ here. There seems to be a reasonable spread across different IQ ranges, but fewer for people with higher IQ levels. So there are fewer play-based interventions for that group. And perhaps contrary to a lot of other autism research, we do see quite good representation for people in the lower band IQ there. And then just finally, I want to point out, we looked at a way to synthesize the role of play within an intervention. And we found that there were kind of three main themes there. So some intervention types see play as a key mechanism, driving this developmental change in social communication outcomes. Others see play more as a context. So you're learning about something else, but it takes place within a playful setting. And yet others saw play as a kind of tiny part of a bigger picture. So just to look at this role of play breakdown here, you can see down the left-hand side the different types of intervention we found, and then the ways in which they conceptualize play going sort of horizontally. And the size of the balls represents how many studies falling into these categories for each component or each approach to play that we found. So for example, you can see right in the middle, we had 76 studies that were feedback based. So that's where parents play with an autistic child and then a therapist gives them some tips and tricks to kind of improve that interaction. And in that kind of approach, you can see that play was conceptualized as a key mechanism. Whereas for example, I don't know, the computer-based therapies, that's a much lower number. So again, this is something that we can post up on our website, and you can take some time to look at these in more detail. I'm quite aware that I might be about to run out of time, so I'm gonna perhaps just end on this one. We also looked at the extent to which therapies allowed following the child's lead, so whether they were very adult directed, whether they were guided, so providing a bit of structure but allowing some autonomy for the child, and whether they were completely child-led, so following the child's lead, allowing child autonomy. And again, we did that same kind of approach to mapping out our data, so that maybe parents or therapists can go and look at this chart and say, okay, I want to be involved in an intervention where the child's lead is considered primary, and perhaps isn't influenced by a behaviourist approach, for example. And then you can look on this chart and select kinds of intervention that might be suitable for you. So just to finish up with what I think the key messages of this review are, play-based interventions seem a promising area for supporting social and communication skills, and stakeholders are positive about that, although there are different perspectives to consider. The general characterisation of the evidence base is that it's quite fragmented. So very few interventions approaches had more than 2 peer-reviewed studies. And again, we can point you towards exactly which ones those are on our website. Looking at the general characteristics of who has been studied, very few girls were represented in the studies that we reviewed, and that seems a problem to me. Certainly only 1% of studies looked at girls only, whereas many more looked at boys only. And finally, we hope these ideas of the role of play, the conceptualization of play as a mechanism or a concept, and the extent to which a play-based intervention is child-led might help practitioners and families to make more informed decisions about play-based interventions.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, for a great review of all the play research. There's certainly a lot out there. Next up, we have Matthew Belmonte with a very long title, Feasibility Results of a Randomized Control Trial of Point Out Words, a Caregiver-Delivered iPad-Assisted Motor Skills Intervention. And now my screen's disappeared. Anyway, Matthew, you can.
Sorry, my fault. I jumped the gun on screen sharing. Right, I do have that problem with long titles. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a therapy aimed at developing communication by training motor skills specifically in children with autism who seem to understand more words than they can speak. And before I lead off, I am required to say this report is independent research funded by the National Institute for Health Research, Research for Patient Benefit Program. And the views expressed in this talk are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the NHS, the National Institute for Health Research, or the Department of Health. Also, before I get right into it, I want to be sure to highlight that this is not my personal work. I am merely the team lead. This is a whole lot of people, some of whom are listening in right now. And the research team includes 1 person with autism, 3 of us siblings of people with autism, although we didn't actually select for that. They were just the people who were best at what they did, and 1 parent of 2 children with autism. A note on the terms that I'm using, I use both autistic people and people with autism, depending upon which fits best in the context. But I do tend more towards people with autism because that's what my autistic brother prefers. Again, it's totally impossible to please everyone at the same time, so please just bear with me on that. So people who speak few words or no words at all really have been perennially excluded from basic research and treatment studies. And we were observing yesterday afternoon that the rhetoric of autism tends to be framed around those who can speak. Well, so actually is a whole lot of the science. And we wanted to address this under-recognized and underserved subpopulation, consisting really of about a quarter, depending how you measure it, of all people with autism. So the background to this is that about 7 years ago, we identified in our clinical sample of non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic children, about a third of them had this very distinctive pattern wherein when we looked at their motor skills, their oral motor skills, that is the ability to move the mouth and the vocal tract were highly impaired, but their receptive language, their ability to understand speech, was pretty much okay. And their expressive language was again quite impaired. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to infer from this that maybe in these particular people, again, this is about a third of our sample of non-speaking or minimally speaking people with autism, in that particular subpopulation, maybe the reason they're not speaking is simply that they can't move their mouths and their vocal tracts to form the words. So the logical question then is, might training motor skills unlock communication via some other route, via the hand? So we developed this intervention, which we now call Point Outwards, at the clinic I work with, the Comdeal Trust in Bangalore, India. And it has been my experience that the Indians and the South Asians in general, the therapeutic community there knows a heck of a lot more intuitively about the connection between movement and cognition than we do in the UK or in the US or Canada. We co-developed this app with 31 children with autism and their therapists, and that co-development led to a number of innovations and accommodations, such as accommodating people who control movements without using visual or proprioceptive feedback, detecting and trying to redirect repetitive behaviors, and capturing and maintaining attention. In the intervention, the child and the parent, your child and the therapist sometimes use Point Outwards together, and they jointly decide when to move on from one stage of the program to another. We start off basically in a kind of glorified jigsaw puzzle program. So this is just about learning how to interact with the touchscreen and move pieces into place. Which is quite a task when you have severe issues with just controlling your movements and making your hand and arm doing what you want it to do. Once that has been mastered, we kind of throw a curveball and we say, okay, well now to cause the pieces to pop into place, instead of iconically dragging the piece, you need to tap the appropriate symbol with which the piece is labeled. And so from this, we move from assembling a puzzle to actually typing a word with prompts. And then for those people who can manage the vocalizations, we also have a speak mode where you can cause the pieces to pop into place by speaking successive syllables. In all of this, caregiver involvement is very crucial. The caregiver works with the child, modeling the activity, redirecting the child's attention, and engaging in errorless learning. And I'm just going to do a short clip. Hopefully you can hear the sound. And you can get an example of what this is like.
Yes, we do this puzzle. Okay, let's do kick first. Let's type. C, watch out. E.
So there she is modeling the response.
Yes, you want to try another one?
And you'll see the
balloon.
the child gets into doing it himself.
And now type B. Where's B? Where's B?
He's very much perseverating on going through the pieces rather than the letters. So again, she does it with errorless learning.
Let's type in L O O. Good. O. That's O. That's O. Good. N. Balloon. Now let's try next one. Which one do you want? Do you want chocolate? Chocolate is long. Let's try book. Let me try book. Waiting. All right.
Okay, so eventually he starts doing it himself. So I'll cut it off there. just in the interest of time, but that gives you a good sense of what the program is about. We do pick up, using point out words, differences in motor interaction between autistic and a comparison sample of non-autistic users. Our findings there sort of recapitulate findings by Delafield-Butt's group at Glasgow. And he has found that autistic motor interactions with a touchscreen surface tend to be jerky, which goes along with this kind of open loop style of interaction where feedback during a movement is not so much used. So we wanted to do a trial of this software, because it's not enough just to say that it might work. We want to prove that it works to develop motor skills and hopefully eventually to develop communication. So our feasibility trial aims were, can parents deliver point out words? Do the users actually like it? Can we recruit enough people to do a full-scale trial after this feasibility trial? And what kinds of outcome measures are appropriate for this population? And are they sensitive to change during treatment? Secondarily, we were interested in, of course, whether point out words does heighten motor skills, and whether there might be any knock-on effect just during the brief trial on communicative skills or family dynamics, and what traits of each individual user might predict those responses. What traits might allow us to target point out words at the specific people whom it might benefit. We looked for autistic children in a wide age range who were non-speaking or minimally speaking, and whose clinicians judged that they had significant motor impairment and receptive greater than expressive language. We looked only for people using English as a primary language because the program right now is implemented only in English. We excluded severe visual and hearing impairments or motor impairments because those people would not be able to use the program. So we ended up getting 30 families, randomized half and half to point out words or to use of a selection of control iPad apps. So they both groups had equal iPad contact time. And we started off throwing a really huge number of assessments at them. Then we allocated them to either the control or the intervention condition. They got the iPads for 8 weeks, and we asked parents to do at least a half hour a day for 5 days a week with them. And then we gave them the same assessments again at the end. We also collected some qualitative data along the way. The control conditions were just a collection of fun apps that did not seem to exercise any of the same skills as point out words does. And I won't go through all the gory details of the specific measures that we used, but suffice it to say they're all standard measures, and they involve measurements of motor, cognitive, communication skills. Some of them are direct observations. Some of them are parent reports. We also had a couple of measures of family functioning. And of course, the iPad itself collected very detailed data on how and when and how often the person was interacting with it. And then again, we collected qualitative data from the users. So preliminary results, people generally evaluated that it was fun and they enjoyed taking part. They valued interaction around the iPad even in the control condition, which is important to us because we want to keep people in the experiment, even if they've been randomized to the control condition. We also promised people who ended up in the control condition that they would, of course, have access to point out words after the experiment was over, and we allowed them to keep the iPads and have that, keep the iPads for a term. People, we did recruit about half the people we found who were eligible. The people who dropped out tended to drop out right when they hit this huge wall of pre-testing, because we did actually demand a whole lot of their time. We're going to cut down on the number of candidate tests as and when we move to a full trial. And the vast majority of them went all the way through and completed the intervention. There were some tests that were dropped at post-testing because people just got a bit fatigued, but by and large, we got a complete data set. So the acceptability of the outcome measures, we found in general that it was a combination of the internal iPad data, video measures of spontaneous interactive behavior, and other assessments that were integrated in play. Assessments that gave people elaborate instructions tended to be not so good. Assessment of oral motor function has complex instructions like stick out your tongue and move like this. It was not the greatest, but the Mullen and the British Picture Vocabulary Scale are more simple. We also used a lot of parent reports, although when we do this again, we're definitely not going to leave them to be returned by post because that was a real issue. Our quantitative measures tended to agree in general with clinicians' impressions, with a few exceptions. We did get people whose receptive language was better than the expressive language. And our preliminary analysis suggests that there is indeed a decrease in visuomotor targeting error. That is, people get better at hitting where they want to hit on the iPad screen as they get practice with it. We have not, in analyses till date, seen effects in our secondary measures of communication, but the jury's kind of still out on that because we still have some data on paper that have been locked down in buildings. And on top of that, our statistician got drafted full-time into doing a COVID-19 study. So it's a bit slow going. In terms of future directions, we're going to be taking forward a subset of these measures to a multi-site randomized controlled trial, assuming that the rest of our analyses pan out. And we're very interested in the question of, can users of Point Outwards graduate after having that practice to interacting via a letterboard or a keyboard? We would also very much like to engage the open source development community. This is something that we were talking about yesterday afternoon during the Fujitsu session in further development. Customizable content, languages other than English, and scripts other than Roman script. All of the details are on our website, pointoutwards.online. There you will find papers. You will find a link to the repository of code. Everything is freely downloadable, including the iPad app. It's distributed under the Mozilla public license, and it's free. I think that fills my 15 minutes, so thank you very much for listening.
Perfectly timed, Matthew. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. If all of our speakers want to turn on their screens and their microphones, I'm not sure if Jennifer has popped back to us, which is completely reasonable if she hasn't. Well, the first thing I would love to, oh, Jennifer, you're brilliant.
Yeah.
Hello. I would love to know, I suppose, a little bit more about you, so we kind of get to know you a little bit. So I'd love to know what brought you to the research that you're doing at the minute, and if any sort of personal experiences shape the choices that you've made in relation to the research that you're doing.
Oh, sorry, was that directed? I missed the beginning bit.
To any of you. So Jennifer, if you want to.
I think, so, I mean, like I said at the beginning, my background as a speech and language therapist, I worked for a child development team. And I think I've been lucky to work in lots of different areas, but with very diverse kind of cultural backgrounds and just families who have so many different experiences. And I think it's always struck me about wanting to make things accessible and wanting people to be able to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So I have, sat in lots of therapy sessions where I've observed parents sort of not really getting what therapists are doing with their children. And I think if a parent doesn't get it, what's the point in that? In a way, it's a waste of their time. It's a waste, which is precious. It's not great for their self-esteem. It's not great for the child. It's not going to get carried over. And it's a waste of resource, which we know are precious. So I think, for me, the work that I'm involved in, and I guess my PhD is a separate thing that I'm doing at the moment, but I think what drives me in that is trying to make, make things accessible for parents. So the key thing about why I wanted to get involved in the ESB was that I actually, when I first heard about it, I kind of wanted to grab it with both hands and be like, this is going to help this make sense for parents. It's going to be something that parents can observe. They're going to wonder why, you know, we're talking about pointing and joint attention. It's going to make it more tangible to them. And for me, that's kind of what motivates me to want to take things that maybe seem, you know, a little bit more abstract and make them accessible for the parents that I work with. I think also, I always say, first and foremost, I think clinicians, you know, you are a researcher because you're questioning, you're appraising evidence all the time. But I think I find, you know, it's important that also being able to share that with other clinicians, because I think especially speech therapists, we get so busy in our day-to-day of seeing families that we don't always have time to be looking and, you know, kind of thinking what's the best way of doing this. And I think we get a little bit stuck in the way that we do things. So it motivates me to get therapists also using things that will improve their practice and identify needs that support people's access to services to help them communicate, really.
Brilliant. And then Jenny, you're next over on the screen for me.
Thank you. Good question. So I have a personal and a professional connection to autism. So I have an autistic family member. And also in professional life, I'm a speech and language therapist as well. So it's nice that we're well represented here. And I've worked for many years in diagnostic services and diagnostic clinics, and I was really interested in play, just in how it works and how it forms kind of an intrinsic part of a lot of intervention strategies and a lot of diagnostic approaches, but in a very implicit way. So I'm quite curious about why that is and how we can understand how play works a little bit more, and where it's similar and different for different people, and how we could perhaps use it in the construct of kind of strengths-based assessment, so that we're not always talking about deficit, but we're looking at difference and celebration as well.
Brilliant. And what about yourself, Matthew?
Right. Well, how I got into this, I actually just recently finished writing a chapter. Well, I finished it a while ago, but it was just published. A chapter where I kind of confessed that I've always been sort of an imposter or an infiltrator in autism research. In fact, I'll put the URL for that in the chat right now in case anybody wants to look at it. But I grew up with an autistic elder brother, and he has never spoken. I always felt that he and I had something in common, and that the major difference that separated us was that I had the ability to speak and he didn't. Things like dust motes in sunbeams, or the hum of the flyback transformer on a TV as you rock back and forth, regularities about our world really fascinated us, and I got it and he got it, and my parents totally didn't get it. Nobody else got it. So I was interested in, how autism develops, and also what, nominally non-autistic and autistic siblings or relatives in general have in common. So I was interested in the broader phenotype. That's how I got into it. And actually my undergraduate degree was in English literature and computer science, because I'm very interested, both because I'm very interested in symbols. But I transitioned to neuroscience at the graduate level, and never really looked back.
And then Lene, did you want to ask any of the questions that have come in through the community?
Okay, there's one for Matthew about whether the motor skills issues that you're talking about are related to dyspraxia, or whether you mean dyspraxia.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the categories and terms aren't sort of don't have fuzzy boundaries. But yes, very much. Differences in motor control, dyspraxic differences in motor control, in general, sort of difficulty connecting intention to motor action in the moment, and making sequences, joining movements together into sequences, especially if they're exquisitely timed, as is, of course, the case in speech.
Thanks. That's really interesting to me personally, because my research is it overlaps with catatonia a lot and the ability to do intentional action. But there are other things to talk about. I
can ask one if you like, yeah. Jenny, you talked about sort of the difference between genders. And I know sort of oftentimes when parents play with their kids, boys tend to get thrown around a lot, and girls get sort of much more gentle play. So what would the difference be in terms of it? Do you think if there were more girls involved in the studies? And then also, do you think there's cultural differences that could be looked at?
So really interesting questions. I'm sure there are both gender differences and cultural differences, but I don't think we have the data there to talk about them yet. For neurotypical kids and research that I've been doing around pretend play, we see differences in the way that boys and girls use pretend, but I don't know whether that would generalize across. And I think there's just so few studies of girls in the play-based interventions data set that we have. It'd be really difficult to extrapolate anything from that. Similarly, for kind of cultural differences, almost all of the studies that we looked at were conducted in North America, UK, Australia, Canada, a couple in Germany, a couple in India. And so it's really difficult to get a sense of what those cultural differences might be. Somebody commented in the Q&A that in some cultures it's very typical for play to be between siblings or between peers rather than adult-child play, which is probably quite a dominant model, certainly in UK white heritage service users. But there are some interesting reports of peer play and sibling-based play interventions in the literature that we reviewed. So that could be an interesting way to look at kind of cross-cultural differences, I think. But there's a whole, I think it's just a big unknown at the moment. There's this whole territory of work to do because we just simply don't know. And I think it's an area where it'd be really dangerous and inappropriate to make assumptions. So maybe we'll come back in a few years' time and see if we've made any progress on these questions.
Right. There's a question for everyone, but I'm sure it'll also be largely answered by Jenny. But what are your thoughts about using play as a route for intervention? Are there risks that using fun activities as an opportunity for intervention means that teachers or parents forget that play that isn't an intervention is important too?
Yeah, I think there's a balance around this, and I think it's something that we should all be asking ourselves if we are involved in using play as an intervention. So on the one hand, it is kind of one of nature's learning mechanisms, and it is intrinsically motivating, but as soon as it becomes something that adults are imposing on children, then you run the risk of losing that playful element. And of course, play is a human right. It's protected under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so I think there is a tension between a kind of more instrumentalist view where you're using play just to teach a skill, for example, versus sort of learning happening more organically. But I think there is a middle ground to be gained. And I do think that what we need is more sort of practitioners who are aware of these kinds of risks. And I think it needs open discussion with the autistic community and with families as well. So if you're bringing, for example, a special interest related to play into therapy, are you making sure that that's not the only time in which the person gets to access the special interest? You know, are you making opportunities somewhere else, or are you saying actually, you know, this is protected thing that we want to keep the enjoyment and the pleasure in, and we won't bring it into therapy. But until we start to have those conversations, I think we run a risk of just really unthinkingly turning play into something very instrumental, and that's not something that I want to see.
That's great. Thank you for that, Jenny. I think we're just about at time for our tea break, and it's down as a tea break, so coffee drinkers, you're out of luck. It has to be tea. So thank you very much to all of our speakers from the first session. Jennifer, if you have to run off and you can't be with us for the rest of it, thank you again. It's been lovely to hear about your work. So if you guys want to turn off your cameras and your microphones, and you can all go and get yourselves some tea, and we will be back at 11:30. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'm still madly typing answers to questions in the Q&A.
Fantastic. That's
We'll
great.
try to answer everything.
Oh yeah, I'll do mine as well. Thank you.
Yeah, they'll stay there. The questions won't disappear.